This is the video podcast for Chapter 15, which is on floodplain ecology and geomorphology. And we've already seen from the video that you watched on bankful discharge that we can define a floodplain as a relatively flat depositional surface subject to periodic inundation with water. What I want to do in this video podcast is present to you concepts about floodplains drawing on the same approach that we use for wetlands. Not all wetlands are floodplains, not all floodplains are wetlands, but the idea of going through floodplains systematically using the hydrogeomorphic method where we look at the landscape context, we look at the water balance, and then we look at the hydrodynamics and fluxes that are there. I think that's a very productive way to go about it. After that, we'll look at ecological concepts and try to blend all of that together. This first slide shows three different contexts for floodplains because floodplains can occur throughout the landscape. They can occur in the high mountains, such as you see in the alpine context. They can occur in a braided river. Braided means there's a lot of intermixing channels. And then they can occur in what we most commonly think of with meandering rivers, where you have a well-defined lowland valley and you have, say, one river that's flowing and meandering down that valley. We can classify river corridors into a relatively convenient way using the diagram that's shown here into four broad types. We have braided rivers, which have multiple channels. We have meandering rivers, and then we have relatively straight channels. Finally, we can have channels where there are different single channels that are going through, but there are many of them across the landscape. They're not necessarily interacting a whole lot, although they can form more of a network. But there are large areas in between those channels where there's largely inactive areas. So in the figure that you see here and that I'm looking at, the area in yellow would most likely be considered the floodplain because that's where the river is meandering across and actively changing the land, and that means that, over a period of 10 to 100 years, those areas are seeing water regularly enough to receive deposition and erosion and create a floodplain surface. You can see that there are some numbers that are assigned here that can help you to differentiate these different landscapes. First, of course, if you have a map or aerial photo that you're looking at, you can really just see that, and that's not very hard. But it's good to also be able to quantify that, to be able to convey that scientifically. And for doing that, we have the braiding parameter and also this sinuosity index. And I think they're pretty self-explanatory, so you can pretty much look at that on your own. Two variables that strongly control the occurrence of these different kinds of floodplains are discharge, shown here as Q, and then slope, shown as S. Again, from the bankful discharge video and other things that we've talked about, there's this idea that the flow that just fills the geometric channel is one that's particularly important in controlling the fate of the channel. And by fate, we mean how does that change in space and time. And if we look at, as discharge increases, there's more opportunity to do work. As valley slope increases, then we're getting steeper and steeper. And so you put those two together, and you're talking about more force being imposed and slope, being essentially a measure of gravity and driving change. So you put those two together, and so you start in the lower left, and you have a relatively straight and simple channel. And then along the diagonal, if both of those are increasing, then you get more dynamic river corridors, which means that more of the corridor is active. And by definition, that leads to a braiding condition. So you go straight to meandering to transitional and then braided. So let's talk about some of the processes that are responsible for forming floodplains, as well as they just occur when you have a channel floodplain system in a river corridor. The first most obvious one would be just overbank deposition. When the water rises high enough that it's going to flow out of the channel, then it's going to carry sediment and biological materials. It might carry fish, and it's going to go out onto the floodplain and create deposits. And what you typically see, if we start here in the upper left, is you might see that the coarser the material, then once the water is out of the channel, it's not moving as fast, and so it's not going to be able to transfer and move that very coarse material like gravel or even coarse sand very far. And so you get a pile of that adjacent to the channel, and we call that a natural levee. Beyond that, then you also can start to have deposition that's taking place. So, you have a surface, maybe a big flood comes through, and on the falling end of that, whatever material is being carried by the flood will start to settle out. And so over a period of many years, this is a case where it's showing the floodplain is building. And then as it's building, it eventually achieves this, what they call mature point. And you can see that the elevation is highest closest to the channel, and it's lower farther away. And you could also understand that the material is getting finer the farther away from the channel as well. And then finally, it's conceivable that you could have a flood so big that it might strip away all of that material and get you back to an initial condition. And so over hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of years, the river valley is constantly evolving. Generally, it might be filling in, but you get a change in climate, a change in glacial conditions, a change in land use like deforestation, things that are going to change the amount of water being delivered and the amount of sediment being delivered are going to have a big influence on what happens downstream in the lowlands and just in areas where there's enough sediment to form floodplains. Another thing that can happen is that the channel is sinuous, and by being sinuous, that means it's subjected to the processes of meander migration. And this slide shows a number of different ways where a river shown in this black line can change and move in a new direction. So the dashed line shows where it's going to, what's going to happen to it, and the black line shows what it is right now. So you can read all of those for yourself and try to think, how does this river have to contort? The reason why this happens primarily is because the water that's in the channel, it's not just flowing like down the river, as it flows downstream, and this is like a top view of a river where we have a left bank and a right bank, and let's just say that the water is flowing from bottom to top, then the water tends to flow to the outer bank, and then it's flowing into the inner bank. And here we can see at these cross sections A, B, and C that where there's a straightaway like at A to A prime, the highest velocity core, which is shown in dark gray, might be in the center of the channel. But then so here we're going like from A to B to C, so the water's flowing down, but it doesn't really make too much difference. So by the time you get to point B, now that core has pushed all the way out. Momentum carries it to the outside, and it hits the outer bank. And so you see the high velocity core is right there against the bank, and that's what can create erosion. And it's not just that the flow is going in one direction, but there are actually more complicated circulations that are taking place. That's really beyond the scope of the class, and as a result of all of that activity, you get these different meander migration processes. So the key is channels don't stay in one place, they move around. Another thing that can happen is that a meandering river can cut off a section, like one of the meander bends, and form something called an oxbow lake. So here we have a meandering river on the top, and eventually, as it meanders, two bends might come quite close together and form what's called a neck. Well, then if you have a big enough flood, floodwaters carry momentum. And momentum means that if you're moving very fast, it's hard to change your direction when you're moving at that high speed. And so what can happen is the water can just blast straight across the neck and cut it off. And when it cuts it off, then it may deposit sediment at those old junctions and plug them up. Now those, if they don't plug completely, then it'll form something we call a tie channel because it's tying the oxbow to the river. But if it doesn't do that, then you just have a completely isolated oxbow lake. And here are some photos that are illustrating meanders, a neck, and then a cutoff, an oxbow. Another thing is that not only is the river meandering, but as it meanders, it creates what we call a meander belt. So the belt is shown in dark gray here. You see the meandering river in the middle. There's the belt, which is the dotted shaded area, and the belt represents the land over which the river has migrated in a relatively recent period. Then you get farther away, and these squiggles out near the edge of a valley represent very old, locations of the channel that are now just abandoned oxbow lakes. So the meander belt itself can meander and move around so there are some metrics here that we can use to determine the sinuosity of the meander belt in the valley, and I'm not going to go into that right now. Another key process that takes place that affects floodplain creation and destruction is called avulsion. It's probably something that you've never heard of, but it's a process in which you have a river, and the river begins to break out and start to head in a new direction. In general, if we go back a few slides, remember how, if you look in the upper right here, how the floodplain is lower away, farther away from the natural levee. Well, in this schematic, the channel bed elevation isn't changing, but in fact, the channels can grade too. A grade means go up. So if the channel was filling in and keeping in pace with the floodplain as everything goes up together, it can happen that the distal part of the floodplain here far away could actually be at a lower elevation than the riverbed. And so when that happens, then avulsion can occur. And in avulsion, we see that the channel breaks through the natural levee, and then eventually the river may just drain down in a completely new direction because the floodplain is lower than the elevation of the channel. And so there's a lot of terms here. I'm not going to read through all these. You can pause and read them on your own or just look at them on the handout. But the bottom line is that let's think about what channels can do. They can just fill up with sediment, they can scour straight down, they can meander, and then they can avulse and go in an entirely new direction. So that's just an example of some of the processes that are there. And actually, there's been a terrific renaissance just in the last few years in which we've learned a lot more about the different processes by which rivers change. And this is a study that was done by a postdoc and I, in which we characterized all the different processes that are taking place in a channel and floodplain in a section of the lower Yuba River. In the middle are the names of all the different processes. The map on the right shows the amount of scour and fill. So scour is shown in the colors of yellow, orange, and red, where the more red it is, the more scour has occurred. And then the shades of blue indicate fill, or deposition, with the darker blue being more deposition. On the left, you see a classification of that scour or fill according to the different processes. And I'm not going to go into how we got this, but the important thing that you can see is look how diverse change is in a river corridor when you look at it in detail. There are clear patterns and organization to how these processes have occurred. Another thing that's of interest to people who study floodplains is whether the processes by which they change are vertical or lateral. From a hydrological perspective, we've seen that hydrologists think of the water balance as being vertical or lateral, and then that tells you something about the watershed interaction. Remember WIL, or wetland interaction with the landscape WIL, as well as the SSI function that we had, source or sink index. Well, from a physical, landform perspective, we can ask those same kinds of questions. And so here I've got two pie charts, one for scour in shades of red and one for fill in shades of blue and green. And we can look at the individual processes and break them down into which cause just vertical scour, or which, in the process of lateral migration are also cutting things down. And what you can see is that in the case of the lower Yuba River, from which the previous slide, this was just one spot out of the whole 24 miles. But for the river as a whole, both cut and fill are preferentially vertical changes. There's more lateral scour than there is there's more lateral scour than there is lateral fill, but still, both of them are strongly changing vertically. In addition to characterizing the spatial patterns, it's also possible to come up with simulation models that illustrate the changes and formation of a floodplain according to relatively simple rules for what these processes look like. So the model that I'm going to show you focuses primarily on meander processes, and you'll see how, starting from this relatively straight channel with a few perturbations, we get a meander migration belt. And then you'll see on the surface some red areas. Those are areas where they're trying to hypothesize what kind of settlements might have existed on the floodplain, and that's not the focus for what I want you to see. So as you watch, what you'll see is that the river begins to meander more and more, and you'll start to see the emergence of the meander belt. The meander belt is the area that's inset into the land, okay? And so at first that's an erosional surface, but over time there is both depositional and erosional processes that are taking place. This, you can see that there's also a little bit of a clock in the upper left, and that's indicating that hundreds of years are passing by. I mean, this isn't a specific real history, but it just illustrates the scale of the changes in terms of how long it takes for this to occur. Another thing that's important about the landscape is the transitional zone from the floodplain to the uplands. Commonly, we see features there that are called terraces. Terrace is an abandoned floodplain that was formed when the river flowed at a higher level than present. So if we look at these two three-dimensional blocks, you can see like the hatched area just means that that's bedrock. And then inside the bedrock, the bedrock itself has a surface that's cut. And so there's a channel over to the far right in both of these. In one case, you can see that there is a deposit of sediment, and that sediment has been scoured into, and now the riverbed is actually flowing on the bedrock. In the one on the left, there's a relatively small channel, and it's flowing on top of sediment. What's happening here is that over a long period of thousands of years, the area in the upper right has actually been cutting down, and the area in the lower left here has been filling up. And the reason that has happened is if you think about the elevation of the river starting in the mountains and going all the way down to the bottom of the valley, like let's say you start at almost like Lake Tahoe in the Sierras and you go down to Davis in the Central Valley, at one time you could have a very steep slope. And then over time that could change. And why can that change? Well, what if you had glaciers? Well, no, actually it would be the opposite. Let's say that you had a lot more rain and that rain was producing a lot of water, but you had well-forested mounted conditions because rain can promote tree growth, it can reduce forest fires. So let's say you have a lot of rain and lush mountains, and so as a result of that, you're producing a lot of water, but relatively little sediment. That can cause scour of material in the mountains, and so the dash line would, over a long period of time, thousands of years, cut down and form this new slope. But all of the material eroded out of this wedge, like this triangle, then gets deposited downstream. And it's not showing the whole wedge of where that goes, but that deposit. So the downstream area is receiving the water, but it doesn't have enough slope to handle all of that material. And so the material deposits out and fills in. So I know that this is a relatively complicated idea. But the main thing, just to generalize, is that the landscape is dynamic. River corridors change. Depending on the amount of sediment and water provided, they cut and fill. And that's something that I already presented with that weight diagram, what we call the lane diagram, back in the urban lecture. And this is just another way of playing that out. At times and places where you have inadequate sediment and a lot of water, land cuts. And then in the opposite, it fills. And the bottom part of this diagram shows a river valley with that may have no terraces, like up on in the right three cases, one terrace or two terraces. Hidden underground is an interesting history that tells you what has happened to that valley. So in a case where you have a valley with no terrace and then underground there's no different fills, you just have one type of material, that just means that the system has over the long term been filling in and the channel is just redistributing the material across the land. If you have one terrace, that means it filled in and then now it's just in the process of its first cut. But like here's a case where it's one terrace on the surface, but it filled, it cut down, it filled up, and then now it's either still filling or it's cutting. And then in the case of two terraces, it might only just be cutting down, or it might have cut all the way down, filled up, cut down, filled up a lot, and then cut, and now here's where we are. So, this is, a complex set of ideas to think about how this cutting and filling would work. And of course, this is all about setting the context for the landscape to understand the processes that are relevant for the ecohydrology on the surface today. The last piece of this is that we can look at the three-dimensional structure of a river corridor and its floodplain to understand that there are different, what we're going to call habitats, that have different dynamicism to them, different water nutrient contacts, and different migration of materials that are necessary for the growth of different plant communities, or ultimately assemblages of other kinds of organisms, whether they're mammals or fish or macroinvertebrates. And there are three typical ones again. So there's the braiding context, there's meandering, and meandering could include avulsion, and then there's the anastomosing channel, which has those multiple threads but connected into a network. And so whatever you see on the surface, then that's also going to change the structure of what's happening in the subsurface. And I think this is fairly self-explanatory, so you can look that over. With a meandering river floodplain, which is probably the one that's most common that you'll come into contact with as a professional hydrologist, there's so many different local things that are going on, and that really creates a lot of diversity, which then creates a lot of opportunities for different organisms to live and succeed there, and go about their daily functions. And this just illustrates some of that diversity. And to go with that, I've also providing you with a list of some of the different sedimentary features that exist on floodplains. I'm not going to read through these, but you can read through them for yourself at your leisure, to just get an appreciation for all the things that are going on. I'm not going to ask you questions about the details of these, so I'm providing this to you so that you can just understand the diversity of what's on floodplains and have the opportunity to think about that more if you're interested. Okay, so that's the geomorphic context of the floodplain. Now let's talk a little bit about hydrology. And really, compared to the geomorphology, the hydrology of floodplains has not been studied as well. I actually had a graduate student recently ask me, if you have water flowing down a floodplain, how can I make a water balance out of it? And the answer is it's very, very hard. It's easy to measure the rainfall. It's easy to measure evapotranspiration, or just bare water evaporation. It's pretty easy to measure the water level. You just get a water stage recorder. But it's very hard to measure the hydrologic flux onto a floodplain and off of a floodplain. It just depends on the nature of the connectivity. So one of the things you can try to do is begin by making a stick figure diagram. And this is a diagram that I made for the Cosumnes River as part of a large consortium many years ago. So here we have the rivers that are flowing and potentially influencing a relativized floodplain in a lowland area in the Sacramento region. And we have the Cosumnes River as one of the larger rivers flowing in, as well as the Mokelumne. In addition to that, there's two major creeks, Laguna Creek and this is probably Deer Creek or something like that. I don't know why the K is there. But anyway, it could be Dry Creek also. And then when you look at the floodplain, in this case, because there's a lot of agriculture, agriculture provides a set of levees and ditches that really isolates different sections of the floodplain in this case. So we can identify individual sections as pools that are out there that can receive water and materials from the inflowing streams. And so then you just have to figure out which ones are connected to which and draw arrows accordingly as to how water comes from the streams and then how they connect to each other. For example, this one in the upper right, this pool, is isolated. The only way water gets to that is by flowing through another one. But then the directionality of drainage can be different from the directionality of fill. And so, in the end here, water all has to move down through to these last three boxes here and then out back to the Mokelumne River. So there's a lot of ways that one can try to do this. You can just try to track it, like a water balance style, or you can try to model it. You can model it using transfer coefficients. You can model it using, the equations of motion. There's really a lot of different ways. This is some data that I collected on the Cosumnes River floodplain that illustrates the different processes in different areas. In some ways, it's not unlike the tidal situation that we already looked at the tidal data, except instead of having a up down frequency response, here we have a little bit different signal. But the key thing that is similar is that what happens is totally a function of the elevation of the location of interest. So if we look at this very thick line that says breach 1, this is a spot that has a relatively high elevation close to a channel. So that means it takes a lot of water to reach this elevation, and once it does, there's very easy flow on and off of this spot. And what you can see is that the water abruptly rises and abruptly falls from this location. The thinner line says mid-floodplain. That's down in one of these agriplane pools, like out in the middle. And what you can see there is that the water may come in relatively abruptly, but the water can't get out very easily. So we see a relatively rapid initial drainage, but once we get down to a certain elevation, the water becomes trapped or ponded, and it may take a slower time for infiltration, evapotranspiration, and some superficial drainage to get rid of that. You could also see that the shape of the recession is not the same. Like in this instance, it's pretty linear. Here it's trailing off, but on here it has more of a convex domed shape. So there's very different contexts to how that occurs. And as a result of that, we can think of these as like signatures of how different parts of the floodplain function hydrologically. As I mentioned, one of the ways of trying to understand the hydrology of a floodplain is to run a numerical simulation. The previous simulation I showed you was geomorphic. It didn't have a lot to do with water spilling out onto the floodplain. It had a lot to do with just bankful flows causing meander migration. And that actually isn't a realistic process. It makes a nice visualization, and it helps to illustrate the concept of a meander belt. But it's not very realistic for what's actually happening. And so what I'm showing you here is an aerial photo of a section of the lower Yuba River, and there happens to be a mining pit off on one side here. And then the yellow line shows the elevation of like terraces and hillsides, and then inside that you see a lot of orange stuff. Well, the orange lines represent a computational mesh. It's not a square grid. It's made up of a combination of triangles and four-sided polygons. And this computational mesh is used to take the equations of motion and solve them to numerically determine the depth and velocity at each of the points where these lines meet. So here's another section of that same river. And again, you see a clip of an aerial photo. The water is flowing from right to left across. And then red indicates very high velocities up to 28 feet per second. And blue, like a pure dark blue, would represent 0, so like stagnant water. The black outline shows the actual channel. And you can see that the water is spilling well out of the channel all over the river corridor. And one of the interesting things that you can see here is this is now a prediction This happens to be a very large flood. It's a flood that's about 22 times the capacity of the channel. It's something that is like a 1 in 10 year kind of event. You can see that the highest velocity core of the flow doesn't stay in the channel. That high velocity deep core, we call that a thalweg, but you can see that again, because of momentum, like I've mentioned before, when a river is moving very fast, it can't follow the channel. So the high velocity blasts out onto the floodplain and has the potential to scour there. And you can see that really well at this meander bend. It isn't a very strong bend, but you can see that the high velocity just goes right across and doesn't even think about it. The lower image shows this like mustard yellow color. Those are the areas where this computer simulation is predicting that the river corridor can scour. So if you think about it, you might expect that to be primarily in the channel, but again, with the highest velocities can occur outside of the channel, then those are the areas that'll scour. And you can see at the meander bend, there's this area where there's this protruding yellow on the floodplain, right where the velocity is very high. That would be what I would call a subavulsion, which means that the river is wanting to cut off that bend, but it's not really a cutoff because it's not meandering that tightly. So whether you think of it as an avulsion, like just going into a new direction on the floodplain, or a cutoff, the thing is that it's trying to create a channel in a totally different area from where the channel is now. This is another example where someone made a model to predict the maximum depths on the floodplain in the Amazon River for a section of that river. And then it's actually possible to use remote sensing, something called synthetic aperture radar, and actually map the water depth. And then this is a comparison of what the model is predicting versus what was mapped by remote sensing, and you can see the difference between the two. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about the hydrology. We went through the whole HGM, the geomorphic processes, a little bit into hydrology, but not a lot, and then into the hydrodynamics of what can happen there. So now we're going to turn to the ecological side, and I'm going to remind you, I think, of something that I had in the very first slide, chapter, which was the concept of ecological succession. Ecological succession can occur. Well, it's basically when, through time, the plant community changes. It can be driven by a disturbance, or it can just happen through the processes of competition and predation and mortality, immigration. So it can be driven entirely biologically, or it can be driven entirely physically, or a combination of the two. And then I also introduced you to the idea of hydroserial succession in the wetland lecture. So this is to remind you that across a lateral gradient, you'll see all of the different species that going from those that can handle a lot of inundation to those that can't be inundated hardly at all. And so just as you have this lateral pattern, if you fill up an area through time, it could start off as being dominated by submerged species, and then as it fills in, you'll see a transition to species that can't handle as much flooding to species that can't handle any flooding. And so that's what we call hydroserial succession. Okay, so let's look at this in the floodplain ecology context. We can define the idea of a physical habitat as being the attributes of the physical nature of the land that promote organism growth and survival, or really any kind of function, reproduction, predation, competition, whatever it's promoting. And these might be things like shown here in the floodplain context, substrate stability. Like if a place is constantly shifting sands around, then it isn't very likely to handle the growth of floating floating leaf plants, something like that. Water regime, each species is tuned to a certain level of flooding. That's something that we already have talked about in the wetland lecture for freshwater wetlands. And then finally, nutrient availability. For example, if you have like very fine sediment, then nutrients like phosphorus might be absorbed onto that fine sediment and be available to those plants. In terms of the community dynamics, I've been mentioning these quite a bit, but just to give you some definitions of migration, competition, and predation, these are three of the ones that ecologists try to assess for what's happening on a floodplain. There's also the idea of the food web, which just traces how different organisms grow according to what their food sources are. So for example, we could start at the bottom here where it says surface runoff or hyporheic flow. Hyporheic flow is flow through the ground, under a river channel primarily, but not always that like that. Okay, and so from that water, then that might be carrying dissolved inorganic nutrients. You can see that if you move up, those nutrients promote aquatic macrophytes, periphyton, and phytoplankton. If you don't know what those are, pause here and you can go look them up because you should know what those are. Detritus just means particulate material. There are fish that eat detritus, and they may also be eaten by. They also may eat periphyton. And then those fish in turn are eaten by pisciferous fish, which means fish-eating fish. And then we have omnivorous fish that could also be eaten by Pacific fish or vice versa. And then finally everything comes up and then people gobble gobble, we eat them. So that's an example of a food web, and it's actually not that complicated if you follow the big arrows without worrying too much about all the little ones. Well, disturbance is a theme that we've been talking about all quarter long, and it's very, very important on a floodplain. It's very, if you go onto an aerial photo like Google Earth or something like that, and you look at the anywhere in the landscape where you have a river, you're going to see the evidence of disturbance. You just have to learn to look for that. When you have a flood that really wipes out a floodplain, then you're going to have an opportunity to have new growth. And new growth usually means that things are going to be growing and they're going to have the same age. That's like a cohort. And then let's say you have another flood, but that flood only wipes out part of the cohort. Then you could have a new cohort that develops, but only in the areas that it was accessible to. And so one thing you can commonly see on floodplains are areas of even-aged stands of vegetation. So this leads to the concept of like how good are different species at growing and competing with each other for resources, whether it's sunlight, water, or nutrients. And so in ecology, there is a concept of generally two different types of species. Those that are very fast growers that can pioneer and establish themselves in an otherwise harsh landscape fairly quickly. And then there are K-type species, and these are ones that take time to establish, but once they do, they can have a lot of tricks in their little toolbox for how they can outcompete the R-type species. This is something we're going to talk more when we get into the modeling arena, and we talk about ecological modeling, and we look at some of those models. But it's relevant here in the floodplain context, because we can look at different floodplains in terms of their physical attributes, and we can infer what we would expect the ecology to be like. For example, if we look at the photo on the right, you see a braided floodplain. Well, the braided floodplain is changing so much that there's simply no time for a long-lived tree to get established on it. And so as a result, whatever species are going to be there are probably going to need to die out and then reestablish itself by seeds on an annual basis. And that would be an example of like R-type grass and shrubs. On the other hand, excuse me, if you look at the left, at the anastomosing floodplain, you can see that in fact you have, look at the trees that are right along the channel. They're taking advantage of the well-drained soils that are there, and they're very long-lived. Those relatively stable channels, good access to water, well-drained soils, that's promoting trees. But you do see a mosaic across the landscape depending on the hydroserial condition that's present, all of the aspects of the natural flow regime and how they express themselves. Another important ecological process is recruitment. So recruitment is the process by which a tree comes into a new area, like migrates in, and usually carried by flow or blown through air as seed, and then germinates and begins to grow. And typically, when you're talking about a floodplain, the key factor is whether the soils are moist enough, obviously, and whether there's enough sunlight. Obviously, those are always going to be important. But the main source of water on a floodplain often is the groundwater table that's connected to the channel. And so we have a series of 3 plots here. The y-axis is the elevation above the stage of base flow. The x-axis is month, focusing on the springtime, which is a common growing period. Now this is a North American perspective, because in the southern hemisphere, the springtime is not going to be in these months. So you just have to think about it differently for those months. But within our context, there's a band of elevation here we call the recruitment bands, and it's within that range of elevation that plants will have the ability to get at the groundwater table in addition to having moisture at the surface in order to grow. And it shows 2 boxes here. One is for cottonwood and the other is for sandbar willow. The vertical lines represent the months within which those tend to grow. And so those are the conditions that are required in order for germination and recruitment to take place. Now, in order for that to happen, the water has to be in that box. So you could imagine a line like this green line. Imagine that this is the recession of a hydrograph. So a hydrograph, is going up and coming down. If it's in this, if it was falling along that line, then it would be okay. So here's a hydrograph on the bottom, and you can see that there's a period in here in which we're inside the cottonwood box, and so that's the duration over which recruitment can take place for cottonwoods. And then similarly, here we are inside the pink box, and so that's the period of time when we can have that for sandbar willow. So, coming back to these top lines, if it's falling too fast, which in this case is shown as 2.5 centimeters per day, and this is shown as 1 centimeter per day. If it's falling too fast, like you see in the beginning here of this stage, then even though it's inside this box, it's plausible that the seeds will not be inundated enough and have enough access to water in order for them to germinate and have recruitment be successful. But once the rate of recession levels out, then that can really take place. Okay, so let's look more specifically at some of the different regions that are on the floodplain and in the channel, just thinking of the river corridor as a whole. Here's a photo that shows a gravel cobble substrate, free draining, active, coarse textured zone. The water regime is going to hinge entirely on the floods that are taking place or just base flows. Nutrients are not going to be held much here, so whatever nutrients are needed are coming from the water. Vegetation is going to tend to be pioneer species, and that in this case generally means willows. We can look at the bank. Here's like the river bank, which is a transitional zone. And as a result of that, you tend to see a diversity of things there. And we use the term ecotone to represent a section of the land where we see rapid changes that are taking place. But generally, banks are well drained. They may be sandy or gravelly, and as a result of that, they're going to be able to handle species that require less flooding. If it's a mud-dominated bank, like you're down in an estuary or delta with a lot of mud, then that may not hold so much, and you may actually see more abrupt change in the species that are present. In the distal regions of the floodplain, there's the back swamp. It's going to have very fine-grained material because that's the only thing that can make it from the channel this far away. It's going to have relatively consistent water levels, slow changes, and it's going to be accumulating a lot of organic matter as material dies and accumulates in what we call the reducing conditions that are oxygen depleted conditions in the soil. Ah, yes, my good friend the Sigafoos tree. So how do we know that rivers are actually flooding out onto the land? And for those of you in my field methods class, if you've taken that before, you know that I always like to take you out and torture you as you look around the land and try to see, what is it that Greg's seeing here? How does he know that the land is doing what he says it's doing? Well, the Sigafoos tree is one of the indicators of things that's happening out in a river corridor. So imagine that you have a tree and it's happily living its life, and then a big flood comes and whacks it off. And in this case, well, imagine that it cut, the whole trunk gets cracked off, or just the canopy gets stripped away. Then the flood goes away. While many trees have the ability to survive such an event and then just regrow, basically, just grow up from the stump, or maybe one of these branches will survive and continue on. And then it grows and grows and grows, and we have two trees, and then boom, now we get hit again. We get an ice event, and it whacks everything off. And what you can see is that, bending, although it might be bending some, but that the vertical parts of the tree are being cut off, and then the tree has to grow new vertical areas, leaving behind the broken branches that were at another direction. And so you get this like step-like function as a tree grows up, gets knocked off, grows up, gets knocked off, and you can end up with these very funny-looking trees, which are characterized by a scientist named Sigafoos in an article in 1964. So this is one of the things that when you're in a river corridor, you can go out and look for, and it provides you evidence that the river has flooded up to those areas and has had an influence on the floodplain. In my geomorphology class and field methods class, we go out and look for many more of these kinds of indicators, but this is one of them. The next thing I want to talk about is PaleoEnvironmental Reconstruction. This is where we go to a floodplain and we collect a sediment core to see what has been the history of how that floodplain came to its current condition. We're basically going to use the layers of deposited sediment to figure that out. And this is a photo that shows some of the layers, and you can see that there are layers like a relatively homogeneous sand or mud, layers that are high jumble of a lot of different material, which suggests very rapid deposition, maybe landsliding that took place. And so we can use a drilling rig, such as the one shown on the right, to collect the sediment cores and then analyze them. Some of the things that we can look for include sediment attributes, invertebrate parts, plant seeds, pollen. These are things that people get trained, whether they're ecologists or physical geographers or geomorphologists. They can learn how to interpret the information that you see in the sediment. And that's not something I'm going to expect you to do, obviously, for this class, but I really just want you to be aware of these things. So, for example, we can look through time and if we go through a core, down, we're going back in time. We can try to reconstruct the history using something like radioisotopes, whether that's carbon or lead-210 or cesium. There's a lot of ways, and that's not so important right now. But then if we look at the abundance of things down through the core, such as heavy metals, here's copper, lead, and zinc, you can see the abundance of these pollutants as you go down, and we can link that to known historical events, such as the onset of a sewage plant, or changes in the use of leaded gasoline, creating it and then abandoning it. Things like that we can help us understand the influences on the formation and pollution or health of the floodplain. Pollen is a very powerful tool. It's not something used as heavily in the United States as in other countries in Europe, but it is something for which there are real experts here that can really understand what's happening. And the reason why pollen is so effective is that pollen itself is like a plastic polymer, so it can survive for a very long time, and we can look at the species of pollen that are present, like what trees are those coming from. We often can't see them down to the species level, but we can get a sense of what pollen types they are and then interpret those. For example, here's a pollen diagram from a place called Chatsworth Bog. So, a bog type of wetland with a predominantly vertical water balance. And a bog is a perfect location where material is going to be accumulating and give us the history of what's happened in the watershed that's fed that bog. So on the y-axis is age, which means we're going down deeper and deeper into the sediment. And then the x-axis is the percent of pollen in the sediment that is from each individual species. Spruce, ash, elm, and oak being the trees, and then grass, ragweed pollen, and others. And you can see that historically, 14,000 years ago, this was a spruce-dominated forest. It transitioned to ash and elm, and then oak emerged. But then also, beginning in the areas shown in yellow here, we see the onset of grass and then it coming to the fore. And so we see a transition into a prairie dominance also with some oak present. Something like oak may not be just local to the bog. It could be that oak trees from the whole watershed have come in, as well as grass and other things too. So it's always hard with pollen to know whether what you're seeing is just local to that site or whether it's in the whole airshed that feeds that. In contrast to pollen, the seeds from plants that are wetland plants can fall right into the sediment. And so there are experts who can find those. Don't do that. Go away. Sorry about that. Okay, so let me just show you, end here with an example of a PaleoEnvironmental Reconstruction that one of my grad students did in a place called Flynn Creek, California. This is up on the north coast of California, where we have sedimentary rocks that are highly, erodible and produce lots of material. We can have landslides and just easily scour the soils that are present there. Plus, these are areas that have a long history of logging and forest fires. And what you can see here is an aerial photo from the early 1930s, and then the watershed where he collected the core is shown, the black outline, and inside that black outline you see just all this white. That's denuded land as a result of a forest fire, and the core is collected near the outlet of the watershed. This is a map that shows the area today, and the forest has returned. Historically, this is a watershed where there's been a lot of logging that's taken place, and then they use flows in the water to drift the logs down to where they were needed at the coast. So here's a reconstruction of the sedimentation rates. So the x-axis as you go across means more deposition, and then the y-axis is in the year, starting from 1200 AD and coming up to present. And what you can see is that since about 1850, there's been some very strong fluctuations in sedimentation rate with individual events that have taken place, and these could be tied back to different periods of logging or forest fire in the watershed. So we can use coring as an approach to reconstruct the history of processes that have taken place, and then we can also put that together with the pollen records that we collect to see how the landscape was, the ecology was changing in response to those physical drivers. In this case, sequoia is redwood, and you can see that redwood had an abundance of about 30 to 40% until about 1700. At which time, it still was high until about 1800, I guess, but then it started to drop off, and since 1850, there was a decline and then a new leveling off of sequoia in the range of 10 to 15%. Meanwhile, alnus, which is a disturbance species, wasn't really present from about 1300 to 1800, so about 500 years. And then it came in, and this is a disturbance species, so it's like more of an R-type species. It comes in and establishes itself in areas subjected to disturbance. Okay, so the bottom line is that we can look at the geomorphic conditions, the hydrologic conditions, and the hydrodynamic conditions of floodplains, and then we can look at how all of those relate to the different kinds of habitats that become available to then enable different plant species to establish themselves and take up nutrients and then participate in ecological processes such as competition, predation, recruitment, migration, and so forth.